Thank you very much, Pat. Your Royal Highness, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Fitness is important in the horse world for so many different reasons, but one obvious one is that probably the majority of horses that are kept actually do some activity. It's important that we, and I use the word activity on purpose because activity is what encompasses everything that a horse would do. And that's whether it's spontaneous activity or whether it's exercise. And exercise is what we classify as a sort of subdivision of activity. And activity is really anything that actually uses up energy, and the energy comes from the muscles. And exercise is a subset of activity with the specific aim of improving fitness. Now, the differences may seem very subtle, but both activity and exercise are repetitive. Horses are active every day, but we define exercise as being structured and planned as opposed to spontaneous activity that horses would perform, for example, in the field or even in the wild. This term fitness, we all use it. What does it mean? Well, probably a dictionary definition will suffice to sort of orientate us at the start. And something like being in physical condition to perform a physical task well is probably a good starting point. We then have the term training, and of course training can be used in many different contexts. Training, teaching or learning skills, teaching a type of behaviour, training to get a certain behaviour, or preparing for something, and that something may not be competition. For example, recruits in the army may be preparing to go on manoeuvres. They're not necessarily preparing to take part in a race. When it comes to horses, I think we can categorize three different types of training. And the first is obviously very important for certain disciplines, for example, dressage. The skill component is incredibly important, very, very central to getting horses to perform those movements. And then we have behavioural, getting horses to load into a horse box, getting horses used to crowds. And then we have what is my real focus this afternoon in this first session, or part of this session, is physical preparation. And we're going to talk very generally about some of the principles and some of the problems that we, I think, experience in the horse world in getting horses fit to compete. If we focus in again on training, when we have repeated exercise over a period of time, that's what I'm referring to as physical training. And if that's done correctly, that should result in increased fitness. So the big question is, why do we want fit horses? And that may seem fairly obvious, but I think it helps us to start to define those requirements. If we take a horse when it's unfit, it's not going to perform as well, or it shouldn't perform as well, as when it's been trained and it's fitter. So performance is going to be better in a horse that's fit. Even if you're just a pleasure rider, riding a horse that is actually fit enough to be able to canter for 15, 20 minutes is probably much more enjoyable for you than actually having to push one along that really isn't fit and is struggling. In theory, fit horses should actually be at a lower risk of injury during exercise than those that are unfit. And this is something I will come back to. I think we also have a moral responsibility to ensure that horses are fit. It's really not fair to take a horse out of the stable and to gallop it if that horse isn't fit to be galloped. And then something that we're becoming increasingly aware of is the social license to operate. What do those people outside the horse world think of what we do with horses? I'm sure they wouldn't approve if they thought we were competing or riding horses that weren't fit for the task. So we have a number of reasons. I've added in one more there. If you take a horse that's unfit and you push it really hard and you injure it, that's going to have a cost, either in terms of loss of use of that horse permanently, temporarily, vet bills. So there are many reasons why we would want to have a horse that's fit. We often struggle with perceptions of how important fitness is when talking to horse owners and riders. In fact, if we're talking about aerobic fitness, this is general fitness of the horse, that only actually increases about 10 to 15% as a result of training. And that's because the majority of the horse's capacity for exercise is defined from the moment it's conceived, and that's where genetics comes in. So we see from studies of heritability of performance that the heritability can range from sort of 20% up to as high as 50%. So that puts that kind of fitness component that we get about 10%. Now, of course, that's important, but there are other things that make a big difference as well. If we're starting to think about training a horse to get it fit, we have to think about what that horse is going to be used for. There's obviously a different level, a much lower level of fitness required for a horse that's going to do occasional slow speed, short distance hacking once or twice a week compared to a horse that's going to race. We also have different requirements for fitness depending on usually the level of skill involved. So where we have low skill sports such as racing or endurance, low skill on the part of the horse, the level of fitness required in those horses is usually very, very high if you're going to get optimal performance. So this brings me to sort of one of my, I think, first important questions. What is the biggest challenge in us getting horses physically fit? Again, one of the things that I think we have a duty to try and promote or educate is that whereas many horse owners believe that injuries to horses are just freak, out of the blue, one-offs, we now have a great deal of increasing evidence that most injuries actually occur in training rather than in competition. And probably horse owners would have that perception that injuries are just unfortunate, they just happen. Whereas I say, actually we have evidence that it's probably the way we train them that predisposes them to those injuries. A lot of work has been done in racing, looking at where injuries occur, what type of injuries occur, what the risk factors are. And again, this supports what I was showing you on this previous slide. From some of the HBLB data from nearly 20 years ago, 78% of fractures in racehorses occur during training as opposed to during racing. So, as well as most of the injuries occurring during training, most of these appear to be due to overuse, repeating the same thing too often, too frequently, or to overload. So when a horse bows a tendon, that may not, in many cases, just be a one-off out of the blue. There may be an increasing level of damage going on in that tendon to the point where you do get the catastrophic failure. But of course, the owner perceives, or the rider perceives, that's just an isolated freak event and doesn't really see the accumulated pattern of damage. So why might training horses physically present a challenge to us? Well, we have lots of different body systems that are involved in exercise. Unfortunately, these all behave very differently when it comes to fitness and training and the training response. So we have tissues such as tendon and ligament, which don't respond very well to training at all. They don't require very much training. They are easily overloaded and that they're a high risk of injury. At the other end of the scale, we have muscle and we have the heart, which is also a muscle, which has a fairly extensive capacity to adapt to exercise, but at the same time requires quite intense challenge in loading to actually get that response. So we have competing requirements in terms of different tissues in how they respond to training if we're going to train them effectively. Another reason why training horses might present a challenge is that if we look at what horses do in the wild, what they evolved to do, it's mainly walking. These are some studies from Brian Hampson in Australia looking at feral horses and also domesticated horses. Interestingly, domesticated horses will, if given extensive ability to roam, walk about half the distance of true feral horses. If we look at the distances covered by a horse being prepared for a three-day event, what we would see is that the total distance in a week is about the same. The problem is the way that work is distributed is very different. So we have, not surprisingly, a lot more of the faster work which loads tendons and joints to a higher degree. Okay, if we aren't doing it as well perhaps as we'd like to, can we learn from how human athletes are trained? I'd say yes and no. There are some parallels and there's some areas where we might make some mistakes if we followed exactly what is done with people or the experience in training people. But training is one where I think we can learn. What we see in the common approach to training horses is basically this incremental increase in the intensity of training as we get closer and closer to competition. We have a sort of rule, increase the workload every 1 or 2 weeks, every 2 or 3 weeks. That's how we get a training response. But if we look at how human athletes are trained, and this is just one example of a type of training program, it looks very different. And so perhaps because there are so many more studies that have been done on training people compared to training horses, we might actually start to try and look at some of these experiences and see if we can use them to reduce injuries in horses. So, to summarize, I don't think we have a problem in getting horses fit. That's not where our problems come from in terms of, I don't think most horses are limited in their performance by not being fit enough. The problem we have is that the training methods we use seem to generate an incredibly high rate of lameness. We think this comes because we see these injuries occurring in training as opposed to competition. And I think this is an area where we start to need to focus in the future to try and reduce lameness. Thank you.